I was wiping down my kitchen island when my daughter-in-law Brooke walked in and slammed her iced latte down with a sharp clack. My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "You need to move out. My mom is moving in." I stopped my sponge mid-circle. Across the kitchen, my son Leo sat hunched over the breakfast bar, intensely scrolling on his phone and entirely refusing to meet my gaze. Brooke crossed her arms, explaining that her mother was selling her townhouse and needed my master suite. She had already looked up small apartments for me near the interstate, insisting it would be easier for a widow my age to manage. I am Hannah Wells, a 65-year-old retired tax accountant. I spent 3 decades paying off this 4-bedroom home, brick by brick. When I let Leo and Brooke move in 6 months ago to save for a down payment, I never charged them a dime. Instead of gratitude, Brooke had slowly been taking over my space, boxing up my vintage decor and replacing it with her own. Today, she crossed an unforgivable line. I did not raise my voice or argue. I simply rinsed my sponge, dried my hands, and walked to my home office. Retrieving a manila folder from my fireproof safe, I returned to the kitchen. I placed the original deed on the table, smiled. "Then you'll have to find another house, because this one belongs to me." Brooke blinked, her confident posture instantly fracturing. Leo finally looked up, his face flushing a deep red. Before either could speak, I picked up my car keys and walked out the front door. I already knew exactly what my first stop of the day would be. I bypassed the decorative hardware at the local store and went straight for the heavy-duty commercial deadbolts. I selected 3 solid brass locks and a new cordless drill. If Brooke believed she had the authority to reassign the rooms in my house, it was time to physically redefine my property lines. When I returned to an empty house, I got straight to work. I removed the standard interior doorknob from my master bedroom, drilled new holes, and installed the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock slid into place with a satisfying, heavy thud. My bedroom was now a fortress. Next, I moved down the hall to my home office. For 2 months, Brooke had been using my antique mahogany desk as a vanity, staining the wood with spilled foundation. I packed all her cosmetics into a plastic grocery bag, set it in the hallway, and installed the second deadbolt. I put every single spare key onto my personal keychain securely inside my purse. Around 4 in the afternoon, Brooke's heels clicked loudly against the hardwood floor. I sat in the living room, quietly reading a novel. I heard her walk upstairs, followed by the rustle of the plastic bag. A moment later, a sharp rattling sound echoed down the staircase. She was aggressively jiggling the office door handle. She stomped to the top of the stairs, flushed with anger. "Hannah, why is the office door locked? I need the printer in there right now." I turned the page of my book, not bothering to look up. "That is my office, Brooke. From now on, it remains locked. You will have to use the printer at your actual workplace." She glared at me, her mouth opening and closing in shock. She stormed back into her room, slamming the door behind her. She thought losing access to the office was an insult, but she didn't realize her problems were just beginning. By Wednesday morning, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brooke and Leo had whispered fiercely in their bedroom late into the night, but neither had the courage to confront me over breakfast. They simply made their coffee and left for work in silence. As soon as their cars pulled out of the driveway, I carried my laptop to the kitchen island and poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast. It was time to audit the invisible infrastructure of my household. For 6 months, I had been footing the bill for everything that made their lives comfortable. I opened my web browser and logged into my internet service provider's portal. I changed the administrative password on the router, updated the Wi-Fi network name to something completely different, and generated a new, highly complex password. With a single click, I disconnected all 12 of their smart devices, their phones, their tablets, their smart TV, and Brooke's wireless speakers. But I didn't stop there. I opened my cellular provider account. When Leo graduated college, I had kept him on my family plan to help him out. When he married Brooke, she smoothly ported her number over to take advantage of my unlimited data. I navigated to the account management page, selected their 2 phone lines, and clicked Suspend Service. That evening, Leo walked through the front door looking incredibly frustrated. He was holding his phone in the air, trying to catch a signal. "Mom, is the internet down? My phone says I don't have cellular service either. I've been trying to load an email for 20 minutes. I looked up from chopping vegetables for my dinner. The internet is working perfectly fine for me, Leo. I updated the security settings this morning. And I suspended your phone lines. Since Brooke is preparing to house her mother, I assumed you two were taking over your own financial responsibilities." Leo stared at me, completely bewildered. "You cut off our phones. Mom, we need those for work. Then you should contact a service provider tomorrow and set up your own account." I answered evenly, sliding the chopped carrots into a pan. "I am no longer funding your lifestyle." He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold reality of the situation stopped him. He retreated upstairs to deliver the bad news to his wife. They thought a lack of internet would be their biggest headache, but they hadn't yet noticed what I was doing outside. Thursday morning brought a new level of passive aggression from Brooke. She walked into the kitchen, intentionally ignoring me, and began furiously texting on her phone, which was now connected to a very expensive, newly purchased prepaid hotspot sitting on the counter. She was trying to prove she didn't need my charity. I simply smiled, finished my breakfast, and headed out to the garage. Brooke's mother, Brenda, hadn't moved in yet, but her belongings certainly had. Over the past 3 weeks, Brooke had slowly transported dozens of heavy cardboard boxes from Brenda's townhouse and stacked them in my 2-car garage. They took up so much space that I had been forced to park my sedan in the driveway, exposing it to the harsh afternoon sun and occasional rain. I put on a pair of heavy gardening gloves and dragged my rolling utility cart from the shed. One by one, I loaded the heavy boxes labeled Mom's Winter Clothes, Mom's China, and Living Room Decor. I wheeled them out of the garage and stacked them neatly on the far edge of the concrete driveway, completely exposing my parking space. To be decent, I threw a large blue waterproof tarp over the pile and secured it with bungee cords. But I absolutely refused to house them inside any longer. When I pulled my car perfectly into its rightful spot inside the garage, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I hit the button, watching the heavy metal door slide shut, reclaiming my territory. When Brooke arrived home that afternoon, I heard her car idle in the driveway for a long time. Then came the frantic pounding on the kitchen door. I opened it to find her pointing a trembling finger at the blue tarp. "What on earth is that?" she shrieked. "You put my mother's antique china outside, anyone could steal it. It could rain." "It is under a waterproof tarp, Brooke," I replied smoothly. "My garage is for my vehicle, not a free storage unit for a woman who does not live here. If you are worried about theft, I suggest you rent a secure storage unit before the sun goes down." Brooke's face turned scarlet. She pulled out her phone to call Leo, completely forgetting that he couldn't help her fix this. She thought screaming would force me to back down, but she didn't know I had already taken care of her favorite piece of plastic. Friday afternoon, my cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen and saw an automated text from my bank. Alert: a charge of $315.40 at Whole Foods was declined. Reply: yes, if this was you. I smiled, locked my phone, and went back to watering my indoor plants. When Leo and Brooke first moved in, I had given Leo an authorized user credit card tied to my account. It was strictly meant for household emergencies, a plumber, a broken window, or basic groceries if I was out of town. Over the last month, Brooke had conveniently started using it to fund her premium organic meal prep and expensive wine habits. First thing Friday morning, I had called the bank and permanently canceled the authorized user card. An hour later, the front door burst open. Leo marched into the living room holding a plastic grocery bag containing a loaf of cheap bread and a jar of peanut butter. He looked completely defeated while Brooke trailed behind him, radiating pure fury. "Mom!" Leo started, his voice a mixture of whine and accusation. Brooke's card got declined at the register. There was a huge line behind her. It was incredibly humiliating. "Did the bank freeze your account?" I set down my watering can and wiped my hands on a cloth. "My account is perfectly fine, Leo. I canceled the extra card this morning." Brooke stepped around him, her hands on her hips. "Without telling us, how are we supposed to buy groceries for the house?" "You have jobs, Brooke," I answered, looking directly into her angry eyes. "You buy groceries with the money you earn. I have provided free housing and utilities for 6 months. I am not funding your premium wine selection. From now on, you eat what you buy, and I eat what I buy." Leo looked at the sad loaf of bread in his hand, realizing that the era of unlimited free hospitality had officially come to an end. He looked at Brooke silently, begging her to drop it. They retreated to the kitchen to make peanut butter sandwiches. The refrigerator was now clearly divided, but Brooke was about to cross another physical line that I absolutely would not tolerate. Saturday morning brought an unexpected and entirely uninvited guest. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the bay window, reading the morning paper, when the front door swung open. Brooke walked in, followed closely by her mother, Brenda. Brenda was a loud, overbearing woman who carried a measuring tape in her hand like a weapon. They didn't greet me. Brenda marched straight to the center of my living room and unrolled the metal tape with a loud snap. "Brooke, honey, I think my sectional will fit perfectly against this wall once we get rid of these outdated bookcases," Brenda announced, loudly gesturing to my custom-built oak shelves. Brooke nodded eagerly. "I agree, Mom. And we can put your flat screen over the fireplace. It'll completely modernize the space." I lowered my newspaper and watched them. Brooke was deliberately trying to establish dominance by bringing her mother into my home, attempting to force the reality she wanted. She assumed I would be too polite to cause a scene in front of a guest. She assumed wrong. I stood up, walked to the center of the room, and stepped squarely onto the tape measure, pinning it to the floor. Brenda stopped pulling and looked up at me in shock. "Brenda, I'm not sure what Brooke has told you," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "But you will not be moving a sectional, a television, or yourself into my home. Those bookcases are staying exactly where they are." Brenda looked bewildered. She turned to her daughter. "Brooke, you said she was downsizing to an apartment." "I am not going anywhere," I stated before Brooke could lie her way out of it. "This is my house. Brooks and Leo are guests, and they have heavily overstayed their welcome. Now I suggest you take your measuring tape and leave before I ask you to take those boxes from my driveway with you." Brenda's face flushed dark red. She looked at Brooke in sheer confusion, realizing her daughter had completely fabricated the arrangement. Without a word, Brenda retracted her tape measure, grabbed her purse, and walked out the front door. Brooke was left standing alone in the center of the room, her fabricated reality collapsing around her. Brooke fled the house immediately after her mother left, too embarrassed to face me. Half an hour later, Leo came downstairs. He had heard the entire exchange from the landing. He walked into the living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, trying to muster some sense of authority. "Mom, you didn't have to do that to her, Mom," Leo said, his voice shaking slightly. "You are ruining our marriage. Brooke is incredibly stressed out. We are just trying to build a future, and you're making it impossible." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. Instead, I walked over to my side table, picked up a thick black binder, and handed it to him. "What is this?" he asked, looking down at the cover. "That is your reality check," I replied. Since you believe I am ruining your future, I thought you should see exactly what I have contributed to it. Leo opened the binder. Inside was a meticulously organized spreadsheet. I had calculated the fair market rent for a master suite in our zip code over the last 6 months. Below that, I had listed the exact totals of the utility bills, the grocery receipts from the shared credit card, the phone bills, and the streaming services. At the very bottom, highlighted in yellow, was a number that made Leo physically pale. Over $12,000. That is what you have saved by living here, Leo, I said quietly. I allowed you to stay here to pay off your debts. Instead, your wife tried to evict me from my own property to house her mother. You stood by and said nothing because it was easier than setting a boundary. Leo stared at the numbers, his breathing shallow. He had never managed a household budget, and the sheer volume of his dependence was staring him right in the face. "Will you owe me nothing for the past?" I told him, looking him straight in the eye. "But you are no longer living here for free. If you want to stay, you will pay me fair market rent upfront starting Monday." Leo saw the numbers, but I wasn't just showing him a spreadsheet. I was handing him a bill he knew he couldn't afford. Sunday morning arrived, and the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Brooke had returned late the previous night and was now attempting to reassert control in the only room she still had access to, the kitchen. She decided to meal prep for the entire week, pulling out every single pot pan and mixing bowl she owned. She left chopped vegetables, dirty cutting boards, and greasy skillets scattered across the island, and the stovetop effectively blocking me from making my own breakfast. In the past, I would have quietly cleaned around her mess to keep the peace. Not today. I walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of large, heavy-duty moving boxes I had purchased from the hardware store. I set them down on the floor and began to work. I did not touch Brooke's food, but I took every single piece of her expensive beige ceramic cookware, washed it quickly in the sink, dried it, and packed it neatly into the cardboard boxes. Brooke walked out of the pantry holding a bag of rice and froze. "What are you doing?" "I'm using those." "You are making a mess in a shared space," I answered, placing a layer of bubble wrap over her favorite Dutch oven. "Since you and Leo cannot afford the rent I outlined yesterday, you will be moving out. I am simply helping you pack your non-essential items to expedite the process." "You can't just pack my things," she yelled, dropping the rice on the counter. "I can pack items left abandoned in my kitchen," I replied evenly. I taped the first box shut with a loud tearing sound of packing tape. I pushed the box toward the hallway. I then took all of my own cookware from the lower cabinets, moved it into the walk-in pantry, and locked the pantry door with a padlock I had installed that morning. Brooke stood there completely helpless. She had ingredients but no pots to cook them in. She thought I was bluffing about them leaving until she realized I was systematically removing every comfort that made my house feel like hers. By Wednesday, the house had become entirely unlivable for a pair of freeloaders. Without Wi-Fi, a shared credit card, or access to my pantry, Brooke's fabricated reality had completely crumbled. I was sipping tea at the kitchen island when Leo and Brooke came downstairs. Brooke was dragging two large suitcases, looking exhausted. The heavy burden of paying their own way had finally broken her resolve. "We're leaving," Leo said, his voice flat. "Brooke's mom found a short-term rental. We're going there until we find an apartment." "Are you happy now, Mom?" "I am comfortable," I corrected him. "Happiness will come when my house is completely back in order." Brooke glared at me, gripping her suitcase tightly. "You are entirely unreasonable, Hannah. No mother treats her family this way. No respectful family tries to evict a homeowner from her own property," I countered smoothly. "You have exactly 7 days to remove the remaining boxes from my driveway. If they are not gone by next Wednesday at noon, I will hire a junk removal service to dispose of them." Brooke opened her mouth to argue, but she had absolutely no leverage left. She turned on her heel and marched out the front door. Leo lingered for a moment. He looked around the kitchen, finally seeing it not as an endless resource, but as my sanctuary. He quietly placed his copy of the house key on the island. They had a week to clear out, but I made sure he understood that the door was now permanently closed. The moving process was incredibly swift. Without the comfort of free utilities or an open pantry, Brooke and Leo hired a moving truck that very weekend. I sat on my back patio with a book, completely ignoring the heavy footsteps. I didn't offer to help. I simply maintained my boundaries until their truck pulled out of my driveway for the last time. A month later, the house was entirely mine again. The brass deadbolts remained on my doors, a quiet reminder of the physical lines I had drawn. My vintage rugs were back in the living room, and my favorite armchair sat precisely where I wanted it by the bay window. Leo came over on a Sunday afternoon alone. He stood on the porch, ringing the doorbell instead of walking right in. He looked tired. He and Brooke were living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment, finally paying their own bills and managing their own budget. "It's quiet in here," Leo said, looking around the restored living room. "It's peaceful." I agreed, taking a sip of my dark roast. He didn't offer a grand cinematic apology, and I didn't expect one. After an hour of polite conversation, I firmly told him it was time to leave so I could enjoy my afternoon. After he left, I walked through my spotless home. I had built this life with patience and hard work, and I had protected it with practical, decisive action. My home was once again my sanctuary, resting on a foundation of absolute control that no one would ever shake again.